So we had an interesting panel up until now. We had information about consumer goods and batteries and energy storage. We had EVs and getting the EV system up and running. We had the finances, if you will, for solar cells, and then we had a perspective from an investor. I have a big list of questions in my head that I want to pose to the panel, but in respect of time, I would want to sort of give it to the audience straight away. So if there's anybody with a question, please raise your hand. Yes, please. Mike.
I was interested in what the payback was, time for somebody buys one of your charging points?
So we don't actually specify what the revenue that flows through that device is. So that's really to do with the customer's business model personally. So if you're a store, you might say, I don't want any revenue to flow through my charging point. I just want to encourage EV drivers to use my store, and that by them being there, I profit that way. That could be completely different to an SME that says, no, for me, this is a revenue generating device. If I answer the question more directly and say what is the payback, well, it totally varies. We've got charge points which are used 90% of all waking hours, and on those ones you can get a payback in 2 years, 3 years. But also, at this stage of the market, you've got charge points out there which are very rarely used, but that's okay. You've got to remember that this is a long-term development. We're not going to move the world over from internal combustion engines onto EVs in the next 10 minutes. We're going to be working on this for 20 years. So to me, 2-year payback is not the only criteria which gets people to invest in these things. It's people who see a number of other business benefits and indeed ecological benefits from why they want to engage in electric vehicle charging infrastructure.
Yep, there.
Sorry, my question is also to Erik. My question is, does the energy company like Empower or PowerGen allowed a shop owner or household owner to resell the electricity?
So I think the question was, are we allowed to resell electricity?
Yeah, you said if you're a shop owner, you probably set a charging point outside of your store, and then you let other people just use it, and then probably you get revenue back in the long run. But is the energy company allowed you to do this?
Yes, so historically, if we look at the energy industry, then you had to be a regulated energy provider to sell kilowatt hours of energy in the unit that we buy energy in our home. Actually, electric vehicle charging is exempt from that. But somewhat surprisingly, I'm not that bothered whether we're exempt from it or not, because you can actually do the exact same thing by selling access time to a charging point, and you're welcome to use the electricity for free once you're there, if you see what I mean. So you don't have to have a one-to-one relationship with kilowatt hours to price. You can also just do it by saying, look, cost per hour of using this charge point is X, and if you use the electricity, that's great, and if you don't, that's great too. So it isn't something that's particularly restricting the rollout of electric vehicle charging points, and it's probably good that way, because I think if we ask the general populace how much does a unit of electricity or a kilowatt of electricity cost us, you'd probably get a lot of blank faces. If you took that a little bit further and said, and how far can I go in my EV based on £1 worth of electricity, you'd probably get even more blank faces. So we've got to move society's knowledge of what an amount of electricity is worth in the public transport arena. And I don't think that's the #1 priority in rolling out EV yet. So I'm actually quite happy that we don't go too deep into cost per kilowatt hour in the electric vehicle charging industry. It's something we will educate people on over time, in the same way that we think about petrol or diesel in terms of gallons, not joules of energy. We don't have to go back to first principles as a country to explain how energy flows. We can actually do it in much more simple ways that appeals to the non-engineering community, I guess.
Okay, one more question there in the top left.
Thank you. We've heard this morning about urbanisation and smart cities. I'd like to ask the panel as a whole, do you think we might be in a situation where we create within our rural communities a situation where we have relative energy poverty, especially in relation to electric vehicles and other elements of access to energy, effectively?
Yeah, well, we shouldn't, given that the rural communities are the ones generating the energy. So this is the whole contradiction of the decision to halt the rollout of onshore wind. So every single rural community was sitting on something that would probably generate in the order of, just for that community, £3 million over its lifetime to be invested into local services, including, in the case of quite a few small-scale wind farms, local bus services, which of course they don't have. So the very short-sightedness of pandering to a very small minority of people, and when you work in these communities as I do, it is the minority of people who are against the development of any kind of economy in the rural economy. And that directly correlates with people who are independently wealthy and therefore not dependent on that rural economy for their job. And I think that what we haven't really linked up is that this was going to be the biggest inward investment into our rural economy since the agricultural revolution. And we've just stopped it because someone didn't really like wind turbines. So I'm quite surprised that people aren't more angry about that outside of the industry. It's very much been painted that this is a subsidised industry and that somehow it was costing us money. What wasn't being seen is the benefit it was bringing to communities who now won't receive that benefit, and the opportunities those communities had to actually become self-sufficient. So, I mean, two things are going to happen from that. One is you will see a lot more farmers going out of business and not farming the land, which talks to your food topic later, because a lot of farmers are staying on the land because of renewable energy, basically. And the second thing is that you will see more people moving out of rural communities into urban communities just to get a job that isn't working in a restaurant serving the guy with a second home. So that's going to be the impact of it. So these things go much deeper than just a question of technology choice. They are about what you want this economy to be. And in rural communities in particular, if we actually want anyone living there who earns a living.
Anybody else on the panel maybe have a comment on this?
I think the greater challenge is actually in the urban electrification with the density of population and the increasing power demand. I think an indirect piece of evidence is sort of paving stones blowing up and Holborn fire, where there's just so much power under the ground. And so I think that's maybe the area where there's a greater challenge and there's a risk of greater outages as we continue to consume vast amounts of power. I think the EV adoption map has some issues in terms of grid reinforcement. I think as a rule of thumb, an electric vehicle maybe got some better numbers, but I tend to see an electric vehicle consumes on average the same as a house. And so it's basically it's a 10 kilowatt hour a day average charge as you basically drive 35 miles average a day in a vehicle in the UK. And so if you just imagine sort of, if 10% of homes have electric vehicles, you need a certain amount of reinforcement. Now, people don't really have cars in cities in the same way, so urban cars are important. We've done a project with, I think, Senex or something, where we're kind of moving electricity around through the car. And there's projects which look at vehicle to grid, but vehicle to grid is a problem on the depreciation cycle per battery. If you fill up a Tesla, it's got like $3 electricity in a large number and $50 depreciation per cycle in small letters. And so, they're not great to back up a house with. So I think the other thing about maybe cars is this notion of the sort of peer-to-peer model, where maybe there's some things on this later in the day, but the idea of resource efficiency comes from sharing assets and stuff in the future, partly driven by the fact we don't have any money to buy cars and lawnmowers and skis and things. You end up with sharing them, so you can spend more of your money on services and bits in the future. So I think that's a trend which drives sort of greater efficiency of the asset. And then locating that is a sort of powering that in different ways. I think I'm not as concerned about the rural challenge. I think there's quite a lot of spare capacity there. I think the urban is a greater challenge which will hit us in the short term, particularly when you look at people like Siemens and IBM. They have models where they sell cities, so there's going to be 50,000 million person cities by the sort of later part of this decade, and so that's an interesting business model where you just design million-person cities, and that's the sort of thing which you've got to do optimally to get the infrastructure right.
I have maybe one final question to wrap up this session. And maybe just like a one word or just a very brief answer from every panelist. What do you think is sort of the current bottleneck for getting abundant and clean energy omnipresent? Would that be battery technologies, harvesting of energy? Is it more of a financing issue? Is it maybe a customer adaptation issue? So maybe we can start off with Bruce. What do you think?
I mean, the one-word answer is Spotify.
Spotify?
Yeah, because that was the music industry thought that you couldn't decentralize the music industry. That's what the energy industry have realized in Germany. The reason why they're so scared is that energy is just decentralized energy, and the energy industry and all of their valuations are underwater. There's a lot of money tied up in one area. It needs moving into the other area. So yeah, Spotify would be the answer.
Good. Erik?
My one word, I think, is decarbonisation, and the reason for that is that I see a future where electricity has no negative connotation environmentally. So I think any attempt to reduce our, over a 100-year period, our energy usage is actually taking civilization in the wrong way. We're going to use more and more and more and more and more energy as we move forward over the next decade and the next millennia. And we need to accept that. We need to be thinking about how do we generate orders of magnitude more electricity. And eventually to the point where electricity has absolutely zero negative environmental connotation. So to me, it's not about saving energy, it's long-term, it's about making energy have zero environmental cost so we can use it absolutely freely as a race.
I'm going to say money for two reasons. Selfishly, we're going to raise some money on Crowdcube next month, so if anyone wants to visit us, please do so. I think the challenge on money is funding energy startups in the UK. It's been very politically uncertain, and that's been an issue on funding tech like ours. I think the other aspect of money is effectively energy is a bit too cheap, and so for consumers in cities, energy is sort of similar to the price of a cappuccino a day. I'd say we don't think very much about having a second cappuccino, but to get really involved in managing energy to save like half a cappuccino isn't particularly interesting. Energy is not that interesting to customers to talk to their energy system through an app, and we don't think they should. So I think energy is not really reflective of the accurate price. The energy system is kind of broken. It's like an old BMW, which needs a lot of money spent keeping it going. And it's also the biggest machine in any country. The electricity system is a connected single organism, and it's creaking. And as we saw in Hurricane Sandy, that knocks out power when you have a grid collapse in systemic reasons. So I think the energy system is going to be very expensive to keep going. And the challenge is finding that money. I think we have found that money, like Abundance have identified, is in pensions. I think we've created something called the Energy Pension Company to deal with the costs of energy in retirement, and we'll be announcing more on that later in the year. But that's trying to recognise the issue of how do people pay their bills through life. And it also addresses the payback issue, which someone mentioned, is seems to be an incentive on energy stuff to desire a sort of an instant 1 or 2 year payback. There's no payback on an iPad. There's no payback on, there's a negative payback by not having energy when the lights go out. That's quite interesting. But given you're paying energy bills over your entire life, if you do something efficiently, which might have a 1, 5, 10, 20 year payback, it's still saving a lifetime worth of energy and carbon. And so thinking about packaging products which deal with the cost of energy over retirement of life or through some of these wind assets is very interesting, because there's a lot of money to be saved to everyone, tens and tens of thousands to everyone in this room, just by thinking correctly about the cost of energy over a piece of time.
Rob?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. If there's not a lot of money in the system to fund things like new generating assets, new ways of transporting energy back and forth, you better use that energy more efficiently, certainly for the short and medium term. And I suspect that when guys like me are trying to make some money, we'll look at a lot of software applications, actually, that to make sure you can use this energy much more efficiently.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much, everybody, for this excellent discussion.